never thought I'd end up working as a night porter at a hotel, but after my knee injury ended any hope of a sports career, I had to take what I could get. The bills weren't going to pay themselves, and at least the Stanley had decent pay, free meals, and barely any guests most nights. Seemed like an easy gig. I was wrong. The hotel itself was old, built in the early 1900s, but had been renovated several times. It had a certain eerie charm with long, dimly lit hallways and antique decor mixed with modern conveniences like keycard locks and high-speed Wi-Fi. The kind of place that felt almost normal, but not quite. It didn't take long for the isolation to get to me. I'd always been a social person, played team sports, hung out with friends constantly. But here, my only company was the occasional late-night guest, or the faint hum of the security cameras. That's when the weirdness started. The first time I noticed something off was during my third week on the job. There was a room, 407, that was always locked. The manager, a guy named Harris, avoided talking about it. When I asked, he just said, "Some rooms stay locked for a reason." I thought he was just being dramatic. But then, on a slow night, I got a call from a guest in 406. A woman, whispering into the phone. "There's someone next door," she said. "I hear them moving around." I checked the system. 407 was empty. No guests. No staff. No one. Still, I took the elevator up, walked down the hallway, and stood outside the door. I listened. Nothing. Then, a soft thump from inside. I knocked. Silence. Another knock. Then, right as I was about to walk away, my radio crackled. A faint, distorted voice whispered, "Damien, why did you come back?" I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I wasn't scared yet, just unsettled. Maybe a prank? Maybe my mind playing tricks on me? That was what I told myself. Until I checked the security footage. There, in grainy black and white, was room 407's door, slowly opening on its own. I replayed the footage 3 times. Room 407's door had opened, just a crack, then slowly swung shut, like someone had peeked out and then closed it again. But the hallway was empty. No guests, no staff, nothing. I should have reported it. I should have called Harris, or at least logged it somewhere. Instead, I did what every dumb character in a horror movie does. I grabbed my master key and went upstairs. The hallway felt colder than before, like someone had cranked the AC in just that one section. I stood outside 407, hand on the key card, my other hand clenched into a fist. I swiped the key. Green light. Click. The door creaked open. I stepped inside. The room was normal. A queen-sized bed, neatly made. A small writing desk, an old wooden dresser, and a mirror on the opposite wall. Nothing out of place. Except for one thing. The air smelled burned. Not like cigarettes or firewood. It was something else. Like scorched fabric mixed with something wrong. Then I noticed the mirror. At first I thought it was cracked. The glass shimmered in the dim light, the reflection slightly distorted. But as I moved closer, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. My reflection wasn't moving right. I lifted my hand. My reflection lifted its hand, half a second too late. I stepped back. The reflection stayed where it was. That was when I saw him. Standing behind me, just inside the frame of the mirror, was a tall, thin man in a black suit. He had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, empty void where his features should have been. I spun around. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror. He was closer. I stumbled backward, slamming into the dresser, heart pounding against my ribs. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on my chest. My skin tingled like something was watching me. And then, the bathroom door creaked open. I ran, didn't stop, didn't look back, just bolted down the hallway, past the empty rooms, past the elevator, past the front desk, all the way into the security office. I locked the door. My breathing was ragged, my hands were shaking, and in the security monitor, flickering in and out of view, I saw room 407's door standing wide open, like it was waiting for me to come back. I didn't go back to 407. Not that night, not ever. But the nightmare didn't end there. After that encounter, things got worse. The whispers on the radio became more frequent. At first, I thought it was just static, random interference. But then the voice started saying my name. Damien, why did you come back? You're next. The worst part? It wasn't just through the radio anymore. I started hearing it in my head. At first I thought I was losing it. Stress, sleep deprivation, anxiety. But then one night while sitting at the front desk, something moved in the reflection of the lobby's glass doors. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A tall, faceless figure standing just behind me. I turned around so fast I nearly fell out of my chair. Nothing. But when I looked back at the glass, the figure was still there, watching me. I didn't sleep after that. Not properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Black suit. No face. Standing in my room. At the foot of my bed, waiting. It all came to a head on my final shift. At around 3 a.m., the hotel Wi-Fi went down. I had to check the server, which was in a locked utility room near the 407 hallway. I didn't want to go, but I had a job to do. As I walked down the hall, the smell hit me again. That same burnt, rotten air. Then my radio crackled. A voice, deep, distorted. Damien, look. The door to 407 swung open on its own, and inside, I saw him. Not in the mirror, not a reflection. He was standing in the room, tall, thin, a black void where his face should have been. I tried to move, I couldn't. The room pulled at me like a vacuum of darkness, the walls twisting, melting, dissolving into endless shadows. And then, a hand grabbed my wrist. I gasped, snapping out of it. It was Harris, the manager, shaking me. Damien, what the hell are you doing? I looked back at 407. The door was shut, like it had never been open. I quit that same morning. Harris didn't ask questions. He just nodded like he already knew. I left the Stanley and never looked back. For months I told myself it was stress, anxiety, sleep deprivation, maybe even a breakdown. But then last week, I got an email. From the new night porter, a short message. The man with no face is watching me. What do I do? I closed my laptop. I didn't need to answer. He'd figure it out soon enough. Because once you see him, he never stops watching. I never planned on working the night shift. I never planned on working at St. Bartholomew's at all. But when you're broke, desperate, and running out of options, you don't get to be picky. I took the job because it paid better than my last one, and honestly, I liked the idea of working alone. Fewer people meant fewer problems. At least that's what I thought. St. Bartholomew's was one of the oldest hospitals in Chicago, and it felt like it. The halls smelled like antiseptic and something stale, like time itself had settled into the walls. The fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make you wonder if you were imagining it. And the night shift? It was quiet. Too quiet. My job was simple. Monitor the respiratory unit, check ventilators, make sure patients were breathing. Most nights I barely had to do anything. But I noticed something early on. People died here. A lot. It wasn't unusual for a hospital, I told myself. The patients in my unit were already critical, but something felt off. The deaths didn't make sense. Some patients were improving, stable even, and then gone. No alarms, no signs of struggle, just a silent, sudden end. At first I ignored it. I didn't want to be that guy, the new hire making accusations, but the more I watched, the harder it became to brush it off. One night, Olivia Brooks, one of the senior nurses, cornered me in the break room. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" she asked. I hesitated. Noticed what? The deaths. She glanced around, lowering her voice. They only happen at night, and only when certain people are on shift. My stomach tightened. I wanted to tell her she was crazy, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I already knew she was right. That was the night I stopped sleeping peacefully. I tried to tell myself Olivia was just being paranoid. Maybe she'd been working here too long, seeing patterns where there weren't any. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. So, I started paying attention. I checked patient files, reviewed monitor logs, even took notes on who was working each shift. And that's when I noticed Dr. Leonard Graves. He wasn't just another doctor. He was a legend at St. Bartholomew's. He'd been there for over 2 decades, working exclusively at night. Everyone respected him, trusted him. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. Graves never seemed tired. He never looked rushed, never stressed. And yet, the nights he was working were the same nights patients kept dying. One night I saw him standing outside a patient's room. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. The way his eyes followed the rise and fall of their chest made my skin crawl. That was when I decided I had to know for sure. I started shadowing him, keeping my distance but watching closely. At first, nothing happened. But then, just past 3 a.m., I caught him slipping into a room. I moved closer, heart pounding. He was with Henry Calloway, a patient in his 70s who had been recovering well. I watched as Graves pulled something from his pocket, a small vial. He injected it into Henry's IV, smooth and practiced, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. I wanted to rush in, to stop him, to do something. But my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, watching in horror as Henry's chest began to rise and fall irregularly. Then it just stopped. Graves turned toward the door, and for a split second, our eyes met. That was the moment I knew. He saw me, and now I wasn't just a bystander. I was a threat. I should have gone to the police. I should have told Olivia or anyone who would listen. But fear does strange things to you. For days, I convinced myself that maybe I had misunderstood what I saw. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe if I just kept my head down, this would all blow over. But Graves wasn't the type to leave loose ends. It started small. My locker was left open when I swore I had locked it. My shift schedule was mysteriously changed without my request. Then my access to patient files was revoked. And then I got the message. It was left on my workstation, written on a sticky note in perfect, neat handwriting. You see too much. Maybe you belong in one of these beds. That was it. No name, no explanation. Just a warning. I had to get out. That night, I recorded everything. I wore a small voice recorder hidden in my scrubs and followed Graves as he made his rounds. I watched as he stepped into another patient's room, pulled out the same small vial, and did exactly what I had seen before. But this time I had proof. I left the hospital early, shaking, barely able to keep my hands steady as I pulled up my phone to call Olivia. I told her everything about Graves, about the deaths, about the note. She told me to meet her outside the hospital parking lot in an hour. I never made it there. The last thing I remember is the sudden pain at the back of my head. The world spun, and then darkness. I woke up to the sound of waves. My body felt heavy, my limbs unresponsive. I was lying in the back seat of a car, the doors locked, my vision blurry. The car was parked on a cliffside. I turned my head, struggling to focus, and saw him, Graves, standing outside looking down at me through the glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to, because when I glanced at my own arm, I saw the needle mark. And suddenly, I understood. I couldn't move because he had given me the same drug. My chest tightened. My breath came in short gasps. The paralysis was setting in. Graves tapped the window once, his face expressionless, before turning away and walking back to his car. He wasn't going to watch me die. He didn't need to. The tide would take care of the rest, and that's when I realized this was never just a job. It was always my last shift. I've worked the night shift at a security monitoring company for over 5 years now. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me away from the usual office politics. My name is Dennis Holloway, and before this, I was a cop. That part of my life, it's over. Now I sit in a dimly lit office surrounded by multiple screens displaying live feeds from various locations across Philadelphia. Banks, warehouses, museums. Most nights are quiet. Just me, a cup of coffee, and the occasional false alarm from a motion sensor. But if there's one place that still makes my skin crawl, it's the Mütter Museum. If you've never heard of it, let me explain. It's a medical history museum filled with preserved human remains, things you'd expect to see in a horror movie. Skulls with bullet holes, diseased organs in jars, skeletons twisted by rare conditions. It's fascinating, sure, but being responsible for monitoring the place at night, that's a different story. Most nights, nothing happens. No movement, no disturbances. But one particular night, something changed. It started at 12:23 a.m. A motion sensor in the exhibit of anatomical specimens was triggered. At first, I wasn't too concerned. The museum is old, and sometimes drafts or electrical glitches can cause minor false alarms. I clicked on the live feed, expecting to see nothing, but the motion logs told a different story. Something or someone had moved inside the exhibit. And yet, as I stared at the camera feed, I saw absolutely nothing. Just rows of lifeless bodies standing in their display cases. I leaned forward, rubbing my eyes. Maybe it was a technical issue. Maybe the sensors were just malfunctioning. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I checked the logs again. The alert had lasted only 3 seconds. Just enough time to register movement, but not enough to capture anything on camera. I switched angles, looking at the other feeds inside the museum. Everything was still. No sign of an intruder. Then, another alert. 12:25 a.m. Motion detected in the anatomical specimens exhibit. I pulled up the camera feed immediately. Nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head. Damn system, I muttered, reaching for my coffee. I was about to dismiss the alert when I noticed something odd. One of the display cases containing an entire preserved human cadaver was slightly ajar. I froze. Had it always been like that? I scrolled back through the footage. An hour ago, the case was closed. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I picked up the phone and called the on-site security team. The night guard, Paul, answered, his voice groggy. Yeah? Hey, Paul. Motion sensors are going off in the specimen exhibit. You see anything weird on your end? A pause. Then, nope. Place is dead quiet. Can you check it out? One of the cases looks off. A sigh. Yeah, fine. Give me a minute. I watched as Paul's flashlight beam appeared on the cameras. He walked through the museum, disappearing into the anatomical exhibit. For a few seconds, everything was normal. Then, as he moved deeper into the room, his flashlight flickered, and the motion sensors triggered again. 12:28 a.m. Movement detected in the anatomical specimens exhibit. But Paul wasn't moving. He was standing completely still. That's when his voice came through the phone. Low. Uneasy. Dennis, I think something's wrong. Paul's voice had a slight tremor to it, something I wasn't used to hearing from him. What do you mean? I asked, my eyes glued to the screen. He hesitated. I swear I just heard something. A cold sensation settled in my gut. I turned up the volume on the museum's live audio feed. At first, there was nothing, just the distant hum of the building's HVAC system. Then I heard it. A soft shuffling sound like bare feet on tile. Paul, is that you moving? No. My pulse quickened. The sound wasn't coming from Paul's direction. It was coming from somewhere else in the exhibit. Then, another noise. A whisper. It was faint, almost unintelligible. But the moment I heard it, I felt my stomach drop. It was wrong. Not just a voice, but voices. layered over each other, speaking in hushed, hurried tones. Paul's breathing became audible through the phone. "Dennis, someone's in here." I watched as his flashlight beam jerked around the room. Nothing, just the same display cases, the same preserved remains. Then his light landed on the open case. The preserved cadaver inside was missing. Paul cursed. "Where the hell is—" The sound cut out. His flashlight dropped to the floor, spinning in a dizzying circle before going still. Then, silence. "Paul?" I called out, my voice tight. No response. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. He wasn't in frame anymore. He had vanished, and then the motion sensors triggered again. 12:31 a.m. Movement detected in all active zones. Every single one. My instincts screamed at me to do something. I grabbed my phone and dialed the Philadelphia PD. As I waited for the dispatcher, I checked the security feed again. The flashlight still lay on the floor, its beam casting long shadows over the eerie, contorted remains in the exhibit. But something else had changed. The other display cases, the ones housing preserved human specimens, looked wrong. Some of them were tilted open. The bodies inside, they weren't where they were supposed to be. Then, the temperature sensors picked up a sudden drop. Room temperature, 38 degrees. That wasn't normal. The museum's climate control system was never that cold. I tightened my grip on the phone as the dispatcher finally picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I didn't hesitate. This is Dennis Holloway with Metro Security. I have a security officer unresponsive inside the Mutter Museum. Possible intruder. I need an immediate response. The dispatcher confirmed an officer was en route. But that wasn't enough. I couldn't just sit there and watch. I had to go in. I grabbed my coat, my flashlight, and my sidearm, a habit I hadn't shaken since my days as a cop. Then, I rushed out into the freezing night, heading straight for the museum. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The streets of Philadelphia were empty as I sped through the night toward the Mutter Museum. My fingers clenched the steering wheel, my mind racing. Paul was gone. The motion sensors were going crazy, and the bodies, or whatever was left of them, weren't where they were supposed to be. I had called 911, but I knew better than to wait. Cops would take their time unless they thought it was a real emergency. To them, it was probably just another false alarm, some tired security guard screwing up his shift. But I knew something was wrong. As I pulled up to the museum, my headlights illuminated the grand Gothic facade. The place always looked eerie at night, but now there was something off about it. The air around it felt heavy, like the building itself was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and my old Glock 19, shoving it into the holster under my coat. I wasn't a cop anymore, but I still had my permits. I stepped out of the car, my breath fogging in the icy air. The museum's entrance was locked, but my security override key card should have worked. It didn't. I swiped again. Access denied. That made no sense. Then, I noticed something. The side door, used for staff entrances, was slightly ajar. Paul must have come through here. I pushed it open, stepping inside, and the second I did, I felt it. A cold wave of air, like walking into a freezer. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lobby was empty. No sign of Paul. No sign of anything. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Focus, Dennis." I radioed in. "Paul, do you copy?" Silence. Then, a noise. A slow, dragging sound coming from deeper inside the museum. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The air smelled stale, like old paper and formaldehyde. As I reached the exhibit hall, my flashlight flickered. And that's when I saw it. The display cases, every single one, were now wide open. I swallowed hard, scanning the room, and then my heart stopped. In the farthest corner of the exhibit, where Paul's flashlight still lay on the ground, something was standing there. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its skin was stretched too tight, as if it had been dried out for centuries. Its arms were too long, its fingers like bony claws. But the worst part? It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. And then, it turned toward me. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as the thing shifted in the darkness, its elongated limbs twitching unnaturally. Then, it took a step forward. The sound of its foot dragging against the tile sent a chill straight through me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, angling it toward the creature. But the moment the beam hit it, something impossible happened. It glitched. Like a distorted image on a broken screen, its body flickered. 1 second, it was in front of me. And in the next, it was 3 feet closer. My gut twisted. I'd seen some terrifying things as a cop. I'd looked men in the eyes before pulling the trigger. But this wasn't human. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. Then behind me, a whisper, a chorus of whispers. I turned my head just enough to see the open display cases. The preserved bodies inside were gone, all except for one. Paul. His lifeless body was now propped inside one of the empty exhibits, arms at his sides, eyes wide open, his face frozen in an expression of pure horror. I felt bile rise in my throat. Then, from the darkness, a hand shot toward me. I threw myself backward, barely dodging the outstretched claws. My flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning wildly as I scrambled to my feet. The thing lunged, its unnatural limbs jerking forward, moving with an impossible, disjointed speed. I reached for my gun. My hands were shaking, but I managed to draw it. My instincts kicked in. Center mass, just like training, I fired. The gunshot echoed through the empty museum, deafening. The thing staggered, but it didn't fall. Instead, its body twisted, its head jerking sideways in an inhuman motion. The bullet had gone straight through, but there was no blood. Just a hollow hole where its chest should have been. I didn't wait for it to react. I ran. Past the empty cases. Past Paul's frozen corpse. I sprinted down the corridor, heading straight for the emergency exit. I slammed into the door, shoving it open with everything I had. Cold night air rushed over me as I stumbled outside. The second my foot hit the pavement, the museum went silent. I turned back, my chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The door swung slowly shut behind me, and in the window, just beyond the glass, it stood there, watching. A moment passed. Then, as if I had never seen it at all, it was gone. I quit my job the next morning, never went back, never spoke about it. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear the whispers. And every now and then, I see the motion sensors go off, even when there's no one there. If you've ever worked the night shift, you know how it messes with your head. The world feels different when the streets are empty, when even the air seems quieter. I had been working as a night security guard at the Marina City Towers in Chicago for about 3 months. Not a bad gig, decent pay, easy work, and most nights were uneventful. But something about that building never sat right with me. It wasn't haunted, not in the classic sense. No weird noises, no flickering lights, no cold spots. It was just wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The air in the hallways felt heavy, the kind that makes your skin prickle for no reason. And the elevators, they had a mind of their own. I remember one of the other guards, an older guy named Phil, warned me my first week. If you ever hear the elevator ding and no one's around, don't check it. He laughed afterward, but his eyes stayed serious. I didn't think much of it until that night. It was around 3 a.m., the dead hour. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and willpower, barely keeping my eyes open. My shift had been routine, walking the halls, checking the cameras, making sure no one was sneaking in. Then I noticed it. The main elevator kept opening and closing on its own. At first I thought it was just a malfunction, maybe a sensor issue. But when I checked the cameras, my stomach tightened. The elevator wasn't stopping on any floors. It was moving between them, up and down, without anyone inside. And then for a brief second, the panel inside showed something impossible. Floor 26. The building only had 25 floors. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just overtired. But when I rewound the footage, it was still there. Floor 26. I watched closely. The doors opened, and for a split second I swore I saw movement. A shadow at the very back of the elevator, just barely visible before the doors slid shut again. A chill ran through me. I checked the building logs. No calls to or from an imaginary 26th floor. No maintenance scheduled. No explanation. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check the elevator in person. Stupid, I know. But at the time I thought it was just a technical issue, maybe a glitch with the system. The moment I stepped into the lobby, the elevator doors opened. I hesitated. It was empty. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors closed, and for a few seconds everything was normal. Then the panel flickered. I didn't press anything, but the elevator was moving. Down. The panel blinked again. B2. Basement 2. There was no basement 2. The doors slid open, and I realized I was no longer in Marina City Towers. The door slid open with a soft ding, but what lay beyond was wrong. The familiar tiled floors of the Marina City basement were gone. Instead, there was a long, dimly lit corridor stretching into the distance. The walls were a sickly shade of yellow, stained and cracked, as if they'd been abandoned for decades. A faint, musty odor filled the air, mixed with something else, something metallic. I should have stepped back. I should have hit the emergency button, the alarm, anything. But I just stood there, frozen. Then the elevator phone rang. My pulse hammered as I reached for it. I hadn't even known this elevator had a working phone. I lifted the receiver. Security office. Silence. Then a whisper. "Please, help me. I'm trapped on floor 26. My entire body tensed. I glanced at the panel again. Still said B2. There was no 26. There was no basement 2 either. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know where I am. It's so dark." The voice was trembling, breathless, almost choked, like someone barely clinging to consciousness, then almost pleading, "Don't let him take me." The line went dead. And before I could process what had just happened, the elevator doors slammed shut on their own. I jabbed at the buttons, trying to get back to the lobby. Nothing responded. The elevator wasn't moving, or at least it didn't feel like it was. But then I noticed something. The overhead light inside the elevator had dimmed, flickering like a dying candle. The walls, they weren't the same anymore. The sleek metallic finish had changed. Now they looked aged, rusted. The corners seemed darker than before, like shadows pooling unnaturally. And the mirror in the back, the reflection was off. I stepped closer, heart racing. In the reflection, my expression was blank, my body stiff. But there was something behind me, just barely visible. A figure, standing in the farthest corner of the elevator. I spun around. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror, and this time I saw it clearer. The figure was tall, hunched with hollow eyes staring right at me. And it was closer now. Much closer. I scrambled back, slamming my hand against the emergency button. Nothing. My breath came in short gasps as the elevator finally started moving. Up. I had no idea where I was going, but something told me I wasn't alone anymore. The elevator kept rising. The panel flickered between random numbers, 17, 3, 21, 8, as if it couldn't decide where it was going. I pressed every button I could, but nothing worked. The figure in the mirror was still there. Closer now. Too close. And then it spoke. Not out loud, in my head. "You shouldn't be here." I pressed my back against the elevator wall, my hands shaking. The air felt thick, like I was breathing in something heavier than oxygen. Then, the elevator stopped. The doors slid open with an agonizing creak. I expected to see the lobby, a hallway, anything familiar. Instead, I was standing in front of a massive empty room. The floors were smooth concrete, the walls covered in hundreds of elevator doors, each identical, stretching endlessly in every direction. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling. The air was freezing. And in the very center of the room, the man from the mirror stood waiting. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes, black voids, endless and hollow. I stepped back, but my feet wouldn't move. He tilted his head, smiled. This place was never meant for the living. Then the lights went out. I don't remember what happened next. 1 second there was darkness, complete and suffocating, and the next I was back in the elevator. The familiar metal walls, the soft hum of the machinery, the cold fluorescent light above me. But something was different. The panel displayed lobby. The doors slid open. The front desk, the security cameras, the normal night shift humdrum. It was all there, just as I had left it. I stumbled out breathless, my heart still hammering. I checked the time. 3:07 a.m. Only a few minutes had passed, but my reflection in the lobby mirror, it was wrong. I looked like myself, but my eyes, there was something off about them. Darker, emptier, and then I saw it. Behind me in the reflection, one of the elevator doors was still open, and from inside, something was watching me. The door slowly slid shut. The panel above flickered. 26. I never took the elevator again. Seattle, Washington. The kind of place where the rain never stops and the nights feel heavier than they should. I had only been in the city for a few months, fresh off a bus from Arizona, desperate to make something of myself. That's how I ended up working the graveyard shift at the Elliott Bay Inn, a run-down budget hotel tucked between abandoned storefronts and overpriced coffee shops. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The guests were the usual mix: business travelers too tired to care, families looking for something cheap, and the occasional loner who gave me a bad feeling. But bad feelings didn't pay rent, so I learned to ignore them. That night started like any other. The neon vacancy sign flickered against the rain-soaked pavement outside, and the lobby smelled of stale coffee and old carpet. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the door swung open, and he walked in. A man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, soaking wet, carrying a battered old backpack, eyes darting around like he expected someone to be following him. Daniel Cross. He approached the front desk, fingers drumming anxiously against the counter. "Room for one," he muttered, barely making eye contact. I forced a polite smile. "Sure thing. Any preferences?" He hesitated before saying, "Fourth floor, room 412 if possible." That was specific. Most people just wanted a non-smoking room. I checked the system. Room 412 was empty. "Yep, it's available." I slid the key card across the counter. He grabbed it without another word, his fingers twitching as he turned toward the elevator. I watched him go. Something about him unsettled me, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Another weird guest in a long line of them. Nothing new. But a few hours later, the hotel started to feel off. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard the first thud. At first I thought it was just a guest dropping something. Happens all the time. But then came a second thud, louder this time. I glanced at the monitors. The fourth floor hallway camera was down. That wasn't normal. The other floors were fine, but the feed for Daniel's floor showed nothing but black static. The phone at the front desk rang. I picked it up, half expecting it to be my manager checking in on me. But what I heard made my skin crawl. A whisper. "He's here." Then the line went dead. I stared at the receiver, my pulse hammering in my ears. The call had come from inside the hotel, from room 412. I stood there, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers turned white. "He's here." The voice had been barely above a whisper, but there was something about it. Something raw, terrified. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. My eyes flicked back to the monitor. The fourth-floor hallway camera was still completely dead. My gut told me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But my job was to check on guests, and if something was wrong, I had to at least make sure no one was hurt. With shaky hands, I grabbed my flashlight and took the elevator up. The doors slid open with a chime that sounded too loud in the silent hallway. The air felt different up there, stagnant, heavy. I walked slowly toward room 412. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling in my stomach twisted into something cold and sharp. When I reached the door, I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. "Mr. Cross? Is everything all right?" Silence. Then, a sound. A faint scratching noise coming from inside the room. I hesitated. Something told me I shouldn't open the door. But I did. The room was empty, the bed was untouched, the lights were off. The window was slightly open, letting the rain in, and in the middle of the floor was an open backpack. Daniel's. I stepped inside, heart pounding. There was a notebook inside the bag, pages filled with frantic handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up and flipped through. "Don't look at him. Don't let him see you. The man in the mirror is not me." The last page was smeared, like someone had dragged their fingers across the ink in a panic. Then I noticed something else. The closet door was open, just a crack. And inside the darkness, something moved. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was back in the lobby, gasping for air. The notebook was still clutched in my hands. I needed to check the security cameras again. The fourth-floor hallway feed was still black static. But the elevator camera? It was working. And that's when I saw him. Daniel Cross. Standing inside the elevator, staring at the camera. But something was wrong. His hair was gone, completely shaved. His clothes were different, like they didn't fit him right. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his eyes were all wrong. Then slowly he lifted his hand and pointed directly at me. The screen glitched, and the feed cut to static. The phone rang. I turned, my breath hitching in my throat. The caller ID said room 412. I didn't answer. I didn't answer the phone. I couldn't. The screen flashed room 412, the ringing drilling into my skull like a warning. I took a step back from the front desk, my heart slamming against my ribs. The security monitor still showed static where the elevator feed had been, but I swore I could feel something watching me. Then, the ringing stopped. Silence. A beat later, the elevator doors dinged open. I snapped my head toward the lobby entrance. Daniel Cross stepped out. Or at least, something that looked like him. The man standing in front of me had Daniel's face, his posture, his eyes. Except there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no life. His head was shaved clean, just like I'd seen on the glitching monitor. His skin was paler, like he'd been drained of something. Slowly, he walked toward the front desk. I took a step back. "Mr. Cross?" His mouth twitched into a small, unnatural smile. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked. His voice was wrong, flat, hollow. I gripped the edge of the counter, forcing myself not to panic. "Sir, do you need help?" His smile widened. "I just checked in." My stomach turned to ice. I looked down at the system. Room 412 was occupied. By him. The phone on the desk lit up again. Room 412 calling. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Who the hell was calling from inside his room? I looked back up at Daniel. His head twitched slightly, like something inside him was struggling to stay in place. Then, as I watched in horror, his reflection in the lobby window didn't move. The real Daniel took a step forward, but his reflection stayed completely still. And then, it grinned, a horrible, wide, unnatural grin. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the cold Seattle rain, my breath fogging in the night air. Behind me, through the lobby window, Daniel was still standing there. and in the glass, his reflection watched me go. I quit the next morning, didn't even go back inside, didn't get my last paycheck, didn't care. I tried to tell someone, anyone, what happened, but how do you explain something like that? How do you say, a man checked into a room, then checked in again, and his reflection smiled at me when he didn't? No one would believe me. A week later, curiosity got the best of me. I pulled up the hotel's website just to check. They had a new front desk clerk, and room 412, still occupied, by a guest named Daniel Cross. And as I stared at the screen, the hotel's website glitched. For half a second, just long enough to make me doubt my own eyes, I swore I saw my own name on the booking list, under room 412. Then the page refreshed, and it was gone. I slammed my laptop shut and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits my window just right, I swear I see my own reflection smiling back at me. You ever worked the night shift? I mean the real night shift, the kind where you don't just see drunk people acting stupid, but you get a front row seat to the stuff no one talks about. The things that happen in the quiet hours when the bars are shutting down and the streets feel different. I have. And let me tell you, it changes you. I used to work at this rundown bar in New Orleans called the Hollow Tap. Not the kind of place that shows up in tourist guides. We got the regulars, the ones who came in every night like it was their second home. Then there were the drifters, the ones passing through looking for trouble or running from it. That night, I was behind the bar, counting down the hours until closing. The place wasn't packed, but we had our usual mix. Loud guys trying to impress girls, old men nursing their whiskey, and the occasional loner who just wanted to drink in peace. But then, there was Tommy Greaves. He wasn't a regular. Skinny guy, messy blonde hair, eyes darting around like he was expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. He sat at the bar, fingers drumming against the counter, jittery as hell. Jess, one of the waitresses, leaned over and whispered, "That guy's acting weird. Keeps checking the door like he's waiting for someone." "Maybe he owes someone money," I joked, pouring a drink for a customer. Jess didn't laugh. "No, Danny. He looks scared." I glanced back at Tommy. His knee bounced under the bar, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They told me I had until midnight." I frowned. "Who told you?" But before he could answer, the door swung open. 3 men walked in. They weren't regulars either. One of them, short, stocky, with a deep scar running across his cheek, locked eyes with Tommy the moment he stepped inside. And Tommy? He went completely still. The 3 men took a table in the corner, speaking in low voices. I kept an eye on them, but I had a job to do, so I went back to pouring drinks. Tommy, on the other hand, kept looking over his shoulder. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed his glass, gulped down the whiskey, and muttered, "I'm dead." Jess and I exchanged looks. "Hey, man," I said, leaning in. "You okay?" Before he could answer, one of the 3 men stood up and walked toward us. Tommy bolted. He shot out of his seat so fast that he knocked over his glass, shattering it on the bar. A shard of glass sliced his palm open, but he didn't even react. He just ran. The man who had been approaching him didn't move at first. He just watched Tommy go, like a cat watching a mouse. Then, with an eerie calmness, he turned back to his friends and sat down. I looked at Jess. "What the hell just happened?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but that was messed up. And we had no idea how much worse it was going to get." About an hour later, I stepped outside for a smoke. The air was thick with that damp New Orleans heat, the kind that clings to your skin even at night. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional sound of laughter or a distant siren. That's when I saw him. Tommy. He was standing near the alley beside the bar, his back pressed against the brick wall. He looked worse than before, pale, shaking, his hand still bleeding from where the glass had cut him. I exhaled a stream of smoke and walked over. "You all right, man?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on something across the street. I followed his gaze. A payphone. The old kind. The ones people don't use anymore. It was ringing. A slow, deliberate ring. Tommy took a shaky step forward, then another, until he was standing right in front of it. He stared at the receiver like it was alive, like he was terrified to touch it. Then, with a trembling hand, he picked it up. I didn't hear what was said on the other end, but whatever it was, Tommy dropped the phone like it burned him. Then he ran. Not like before. This was different. This wasn't fear. This was pure panic. I called after him, but he was already disappearing into the dark. The payphone was still off the hook, swinging slightly. Curiosity got the best of me. I walked over, lifted the receiver, and pressed it to my ear. Silence. Then, a slow, deep breath. Not mine. The kind you hear when someone is standing just behind you. I turned so fast I nearly tripped, but there was no one there. I hung up the phone, my hands clammy. Enough weirdness for one night. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The place was nearly empty now, except for one customer, the man with the scar. He was sitting alone, twirling his glass between his fingers, watching me. I swallowed hard and walked back behind the bar. He didn't say anything at first, just took a slow sip of his drink. Then, without looking up, he murmured, "You should have let him answer first." I froze. What? But when I looked back at him, he was gone. There was only a phone sitting on the bar where he had been. An old flip phone vibrating with an incoming call. Unknown number. I didn't answer it. I should have thrown it away, smashed it, anything. But I didn't. And I should have. Because that was just the beginning. I closed the bar an hour later, trying to shake the feeling that had settled in my gut like a stone. The streets outside were quieter now, the kind of silence that wasn't normal for New Orleans. I kept thinking about that phone. It was still sitting on the bar when I locked up, still vibrating with calls from unknown number. I didn't touch it again, just left it there. I just wanted to go home. I was halfway down the block when I saw them. 2 cop cars parked near the mouth of an alley, their red and blue lights flashing against the buildings. Something about it made me slow down. And then I saw why. Tommy. He was on the ground, motionless. His body slumped against the brick wall, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His throat had been cut. Not jagged, not messy. Precise. One of the cops was talking to another officer, his voice low. No sign of a struggle, no weapon. And the weirdest thing, the payphone was ringing when we got here. Wouldn't stop. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned away, forcing myself to walk. Faster now. I just needed to get home, away from this. But then, my phone rang. I stopped cold. Unknown number. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. I shouldn't answer. I knew I shouldn't. But my hand moved on its own, my thumb swiping across the screen. I pressed the phone to my ear. At first, nothing. Just silence. Then, that same slow breath, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned, heart pounding. No one was there. The line clicked off. I stood in the middle of the street, my whole body cold despite the Louisiana heat. I never saw Tommy's killers again. Never heard another word about it, but that phone, I still get calls. Always unknown number, always at midnight. And I never answer. Not anymore. Because I know now. Whoever is calling isn't looking for me. They're just making sure I haven't told anyone else.